Hello everyone, today we talk about the quadrangle constituted by the Diocese of Eichstätt, the counties of Graisbach, Hirschberg and Oettingen. We are in early 14th century Bavaria. We'll talk briefly about the late 13th as well. This is part of a previous context that we studied, especially the bishop count feud between Eichstätt and Hirschberg in the first half of the 13th century. Here we have fast forwarded to, in fact, essentially almost one century later, and it's a bit of an intricate history, this quadrangle, but still fascinating and showing how effectively the different powers of the German monarchy embodied, at least since 1326. Here we will see the intervention in these affairs of Ludwig the Bavarian, Ludwig IV of Wittelsbach, by the same Duchy of Bavaria, and these counties and dioceses, and how they were reacting to the broader crisis of these times, mostly their impoverishment and the way these entities would trying to salvage their own powers, and the intertwinement, of course, between the same. Right. Towards the end of the 13th century, let's say that the Counts of Graisbach, here we are on the Danube, right? We are essentially in western Bavaria, and we are witnessing, just like in like in the rest of Europe, by the end of the century, still, of course, a widespread wealth, but also stagnation, talking productive side of the story. And so different polities trying to simply compensate for the loss in revenue by seizing like somebody else's asset. The somebody else was very often indebted, and pretty much everybody was, but of course the poorest, the weaker, were to cash faster and essentially eating themselves up in the process. Well, the Counts of Graisbach were among these. There were some feudal powers like the one of Count Gebert V of Hirschberg that lived off to some degree of their status as well. Right? The Counts of Graisbach were not endowed with so much reputation. A reason for which, differently from a count like Gebert of Hirschberg, they were not the target, let's say, of the investment of, those money lenders, greedy creditors, fundamentally, that would say, okay, well, you're a big system, you're suffering, we know that you have some pulp, some substance, so we will actually give you a loan, but in case things go wrong, as they were tendentially going, we will eat some part of that. Well, the Counts of Graisbach did not have this, so they had literally to strip themselves of parts of their own already meager property, by the way. Gebert V was the destinatary of the Graisbach's sale of the very, the largest part of the Graisbach Landgericht itself. This was essentially a provincial court, right? A district endowed with, seeing now, some, of course, public prerogatives and more. For example, it had forest rights that in medieval Europe, but especially in Germany, had a great importance. Were historically public royal prerogatives, the one over the forests. This occurred at the beginning of the 14th century. Here we're talking neighbors. There are intricate sort of overlappings, intersections. Here are many different seigneuries, but we can't look at them all. But just the ones we listed at the beginning are the focus. So these greater part of the Graisbach Landgericht was sold for £1,000, which was not actually a lot, and the reason being threefold. So first of all, this Landgericht would actually pass back to the Count Berthold III should Gebert of Hirschberg die childless, which was even considered likely at the time. If you read the first Hirschberg testament of 1291, there was a sense it would have been the case. So they gambled on this as well. That's how we even assess an estate, by gambling on it. That's quite interesting because it well exemplifies sort of the general instability and unpredictability, of course, of the system. Then it was made a condition that the Count of Graisbach could buy back the same Landgericht that, let's remember, was a district with its own court, a magistracy, and public authority, at any point if the £1,000 was restored. That's also interesting. Basically sell something to someone, but if you that's not definitive, right? If you are able to pay that back, basically in this contract, you buy this contract, at least in theory, you should be able to get it back immediately, right, against the compensation. Finally, when you look at, okay, here I didn't insert a map, but essentially along the north bank of the Danube, there were castles, estates, right, and Ministeriales as well. And all those who belonged to the Graisbachs were exempted from the sale contract specifically. So in other words, these say entities were subtracted from the value of the Landgericht. And what happened actually at the death of Count Gebhard of Hirschberg in 1305 is that the provincial district comes back immediately, by the way, without much of a problem, to the same Count Berthold of Graisbach. So here they were going by family, of course, and the comital right that belonged to them. So the Graisbachs, as we've seen, were a bit the underdogs of the situations. The Hirschberg and the Hohentrüdingen comital dynasties were more powerful, right? And one indicator that we have to measure such power is that the Graisbachs had only 20 knightly families in their retinue. In other words, they maintained, right, as lords, these clienteles that provided with knightly service by the end of the 13th century. As we just saw, there were different offices that were held in the Graisbach's dominion, and some of these were household ones. And specifically, the seneschal of Graisbach itself and the butler of Schweinspoint were two Ministeriales that, as we know, were very well at this point on Schwerpunkt, were this servile knightly class of Germany. Telling the truth, at this point was sort of losing in, say, actual recognition, meaning that knights were homogenizing, especially in the south of Germany. The wide majority, we think, something like 90% of the total knight, were characteristic of Austria and Bavaria. Right? They were, by the way, among the richest regions in Germany, essentially the south plus the Rhineland. Right? This was very characteristic also of a hierarchical feudal development of the local lordships. But we see here also how autonomous these were. Right, a long time before, so essentially at the time we were talking about in the video about the Hirschberg Eichstätt feud, the Ministeriales of Lexgemünd, Diepold of Schweinspoint, so this same place had become famous, at least temporarily, under the Holy Roman Emperor Otto IV in his Italian expedition In fact, he had served as Count of Acerra and even as Duke of Spoleto, having been appointed by the 12th sovereign there. I made a video about the Duchy of Spoleto. We will talk perhaps at some point about the County of Acerra. I still have to make a comprehensive video about medieval Campania, but these were some of the originary counties taken over by the Normans. Of course, in this time, the Germans had monopolized them because of all the Swabian affair, Frederick's minority, etc. So there was some general history of connection, as we will see now better, also with Ludwig of Bavaria, of these local aristocracy, their Ministeriales, right? The Graisbach ones specifically were not that rich, right? You can argue that the Ministeriales status reflected the one of their same masters. This is true also, in fact, for the Graisbach free castellans, right? They were poor, and they found in this late 13th, early 14th century not much better to do than selling off even their own property, which came together with technically this loss in officialty locally, in this case to the Abbey of Kaisheim. You have an interesting history of a Ministerialis, or let's say someone from a Ministerialis family becoming a bishop, right? Reinboto of Meilenhardt. He came, in fact, from the Graisbach Ministeriales, that, in fact, in the 90s chose Siegfried of Otting as his own chamberlain and a castellan of Mernsheim, who was essentially himself from the Graisbach retinue. We've made multiple videos about the Ministeriales, and we observed how closely knit they were, how their, say, clientary bonds were so strong that at some point their same lords had difficulty sort of separating them. Initially there was much greater mobility of these guys, and at this point you realize also how sort of gentrified they have gotten, at least how not merely military figures they are also here having an autonomy on their own. They're starting to find other paths on their own as well. And the same bishop Reinboto did this for his help his brother, right? Who was a pretty impoverished knight himself, by portioning his daughters out of the substance of the Church of Eichstätt. And this is relevant because, of course, he was trying to concentrate this wealth, stripping it from the female inheritance. And you see also how the Diocese of Eichstätt was connected even with the same, again, we have a bishop, literally, coming there from the same Graisbach's retinue or Ministeriales clienteles, right? And when you look at these, this knight who was the bishop's brother and his daughters, you realize that the latter's mother, Gertrude, really not Gertrude, of Strass, belonged herself to the Ministerialis status, right? This was a juridical conviction. Let's remember, you were not a Ministerialis but just being a knight, right? You belonged to a family of Ministerialis, right? In fact, in the source here is Jura Ministerialatus, right? So just she would be judged as such. And the ministeriality in question, interestingly enough, belonged not to the same Graisbachs, but but to Duke Louis II of Bavaria. So actually a much more important figure, right? And so these knights and the girls as were, right, connected to him. He was their lord. And in 1291, Louis compensates the Church of Eichstätt by essentially relinquishing in advance half of the grandchildren with their inheritances to the same Eichstätt. And because exactly in virtue of this Ministeriales status of theirs. So in other words, the Duke was helping these Ministeriales by connecting them to the diocese of Eichstätt, and it encompassed in this dynamic 3 retinues of Ministeriales. Right, the princes really cared to essentially increase their control over these unfree knights and backing essentially whichever polity was convenient, especially ecclesiastical ones. In fact, the Ministeriales were forming the bulk of, say, most ecclesiastical armies in Germany historically, because they had they could even the churches were richer to some extent, that they could simply buy these knights, and the churches didn't have much control on capital punishment, etc. They needed advocacies, but they could retain instead control on this knightly elite, and in turn they would back at least any lay authority would protect them, and especially these higher important ones in princely Germany at this point, the Duchy of Bavaria being quite quite strong. As you know, we made some videos about Ludwig the Bavarian, and or at least the context in which this was happening. Now, the Count Berthold III, we mentioned before, of Graisbach, died in 1324 without issue. And at this point, because of this reason, the Diocese of Eichstätt made an important effort / attempt to acquire the county of Graisbach. This was due in part to territorial proximity. For example, the Officia of Mernsheim, Eichstätt, and Nassenfels were just close to the county of Graisbach, and so it would have sort of consolidated the diocesan and episcopal power there. The main problem opposing this will to annexation, let's say, was the absence of a testament in favor of the Eichstätt diocese. Berthold III's nearest heir was his brother Gebert, that was also the cathedral provost of Eichstätt, right? And there was yet another issue, that since the bishop of Eichstätt, Markart of Ageln, died in the same 1324, the chapter of the diocese hopefully installed Gebhard, the same Gebhard, as their next bishop some months before his brother Berthold's passing. However, we know that the new bishop did not really intend to bequeath the castle of Graisbach with all its rights and assets to the church. This is fascinating because this would infringe on the public prerogatives that were connected to the Landgericht of Graisbach through the same Graisbach castle. Right? This is incredibly fascinating. The castle in itself was associated to the district, right? That the public one. So, in other words, annexating that to the diocese of Eichstätt would have meant to simply seize some public assets. In other words, a vacant imperial fief, and at that point having a problem with the same sovereign. In fact, the king of Germany at that point put forward a claim on his own on the Graisbach castle, and Ludwig the Bavarian appointed as a consequence a new count and Landrichter pertinent to not just Graisbach but the Count Berthold of Neuffen and Marstetten. We're in 1326, and this figure comes into play, in fact, the same year which Ludwig of Wittelsbach has become king of Germany, and the choice of this new Count Berthold is due to the fact that he was connected to the Graisbachs themselves. So essentially, Ludwig it plays as smart, as we'll see now, because he said, this guy was essentially a part of the Graisbach's clientele. Here there is a public right that technically pertains to me as king of Germany. I will not directly step in there saying, okay, I will send whomever. I will basically just let becoming Landrichter a guy who belonged to the Graisbach's background, so was basically the most, at least in this context, useful person next to the same bishop of Eichstätt that the chapter thought could simply take over the Graisbach castle, and this will do as something, because you see that there was no real inheritance right by the Count Berthold now, in a dynastic sense, to the comital authority. It was, however, the king that was appointing him, right? Because at that point, at least the Landgericht was really a back-end imperial fief, and definitely the public authority was the only one legitimized in that case to appoint someone else. Now, for something that really pertained to that, because of course the church had its own immunities, it's another thing, does not even belong to imperial power technically. It's something at least complementary with that, permeating it, but being at another level. And of course, in Germany, as you know, the ecclesiastical seigniories are quite powerful, quite pronounced. They are the consequence of that sort of statal explosion of the previous century that has brought, but already since the 12th century, the Concordat of Worms had brought to essentially the feudalization of the German Episcopate. I made a video specifically on that, by the way, in the second quarter of the 12th century. And there are several videos made about princely Germany also recently, you can check out if you're interested. And in front of this decision of Ludwig of Wittelsbach, the diocese of Eichstätt did not actually do anything. They accepted it because, again, what do? Do you go at war with, a European sovereign? In general, like, that is becoming a Roman emperor doesn't quite make sense. And in fact, there is an interesting Italian connection of these Bavarian guys, because the Bishop Gebhard was appointed counselor of the same royal court by Ludwig, who brought him, with himself, making him act as a company on to the Italian expedition on the Hohentrüdingen, and this was also a pretty bloody affair. And in fact, among the other things, the bishop Berthold died at the siege of Pisa in 1327, right? And he even took, together with Ludwig, the excommunications of Pope John XXII. Now, Berthold was not really happy of that, right? Especially dying excommunicated. He was buried in Lucca, but you see, there was some. That's at another level. It was actually a honor to follow Louis in the expedition. Of course, there was a big deal of attrition with the papacy. John XXII will have to. I think I made a video about this, about the crusade against the Visconti. We're in the same years, right? But it was still a matter of, well, you're Bavarian. Your duke is king of Germany and would be Holy Roman Emperor. So the guy has actually the same Berthold as we've seen had opposed himself to annexation of the castle of Graisbach, and the Wittelsbach had made him sort of a favor, saying, "Look, wanna come with me? You will have," because this Italian expedition was an opportunity. In any case, those who followed Louis would have been rewarded, recompensated with their loyalty. Well, the guy dies in this war because essentially Ludwig the Bavarian, together with Castruccio Castracani, the Lord of Lucca, besieged Pisa with their army. It's not much a bloody affair per se, but of course there are these issues going on, and there is eventually the arrival in Rome. It's not quite an easy expedition, but Ludwig is also very pragmatic, very down to earth, sort of much more focused on the smaller but safer gains compared, say, to Henry VII, and he comes back to Germany with really not much compared to what he had left, but still the Holy Roman Imperial crown on his head and some broader affirmation of his power in Europe. There was however, an acquisition that the Diocese of Eichstätt in these years effectively received, not by Louis, but through the inheritance of the aforementioned and past Bishop Markard of Hagen, consisting in the dominion of Gundelsheim. Right, this place, by the way, gained a new officium for the local church of Eichstätt. In 1305, there was an arrangement which brought the Landgericht of Hirschberg to be separated from the castle of the same. This encompassed basically the entire rest of the prerogatives, like the Ministeriales, the landed asset, and Louis IV in 1326, however, did not want to separate this like it had happened with, as we've seen before, Graisbach, right? And on the contrary, he declared that in virtue of his public authority, he would envelop directly the county of Graisbach that had been fallen vacant from the late Berthold to the Count of Marstetten, right? And this included as assets the forest rights, the ministeriales, the dependent and estates, regional magistracies, and pretty much any other pertainance, right? And in this case, the new count was also a man of Louis. In this case, this differs, of course, from the previous arrangement, because here there is a sort of closer intervention of the Wittelsbach. But it's still, as we've seen, connected with an important variety of offices next to the to being Landrichter of Graisbach. In fact, he was appointed as imperial vicar in Lombardy when at least the Wittelsbach had been there. But there were these figures that were circulating. There were actually more Germans at the command of the northern Italian signories that in the hands of the German kings at that point. It was even a letter that literally, before the expedition into Italy, from these Italian, this Ghibelline subject, they told him, look, we already have at our disposal. That's also another fascinating aspect, but here we're talking at least different types of connections of people that were mostly symbolic in the imperial presence. At this point, the German Empire was sort of, declining. The same Ludwig, notoriously because of his sponsor William of Ockham and Marcellus of Padua was bailing out properly of universalism and this stuff because, again, the Eurasian civilization was shrinking due to the crisis, to the various issues, even before the Black Death. And these figures in Italy were sort of relevant still in a symbolical sense. They would also negotiate with the papacy at some point, would even be some sort of, at least with the Luxembourg, some sort of papal and imperial alliance against other signories locally, and that's another story. But the list of this guy's functions does not stop here. He was also the advocate of the Abbey of Ottoboeren and captain of Upper Bavaria. Upper Bavaria is, in fact, this area, like in the west, where Graisbach and Marstetten really were. And in fact, later on in his reign, Ludwig decided exactly the latter two lands to be given as an appanage for one of his own grandsons, that was Frederick of Bavaria, who had also married, here that's so straightforward as a connection as it can be, and for this very specific purpose of reinforcing that legal bond to with Count Berthold's daughter and heiress as well, Anna, right? Because they knew at least that she was the only heiress, and the couple had only one child, Elizabeth, who would actually marry in Italy Marco Visconti of Milan, but who also died young. All right, so you see here yet another Ghibelline connection from these Bavarians with essentially the Milanese, like the Habsburgs, that were fierce rivals of the Wittelsbachs, as you know, were playing more with the Veronese, the La Scala, right? But there were also more troubles. It had been, especially after the case that after Ludwig had captured his own cousin Frederick III of Austria. Like, he had actually risen to power, and Bavaria was actually the stronger of the two powers, right? The Bavarian and the Austrian ones. There is, however, another accident, that is to say, the arrangement about the aforementioned appanage for Frederick of Bavaria could not really succeed, inasmuch as Berthold of Marstetten died in 1342. So what happened at that point is that the same imperial officials took over the county of Graisbach finally, becoming so important as being the Landgericht of Upper Bavaria, as it were. So you see how we've seen it in the regional and the dynastic series. Many of these families die out really during this period, during the crisis, also just probably lack of purpose. This dynastic extinctions are very often concentrated in this same time of crisis. You say, well, why did that happen? It didn't happen so often, right, to have this kind of contraction, even as far as the biology of the rulers was concerned. Well, look at today, right? The idea that when there is a material crisis, it's because actually this is triggered by a moral crisis of some sort, and here it's including breeding, and this was also incredibly relevant because we're talking here about substantial assets. Okay, Graisbach was, as we've seen, fairly weak, but overall, like just considering the average person, still, if you are at the head of that, if you have this inheritances, what really matters, aside from what these people can cover as a broader, let's say, it's been just now multiple offices, is still, an important source of revenue to a degree, right? It seems, for example, that the bishop itself is gaining out of this, because at the end of the day, bishops are elected at every generation. They don't have children on the cathedral chair. And what happens, in fact, is this ecclesiastical principality is gaining an incredible power, especially in the Franconian part of the diocese, because it's basically frontier between Bavaria and Franconia in the north. What had happened with Graisbach was, as we've seen, a failed attempt, but essentially on the wake of the same episcopal purchases and acquisitions since the 80s of the 13th century. And there was another problem, because the increasing power of these polities were dangerous for the unity of the St. Wittelsbach's house, in a way. I mean, even the Duchy of Bavaria, as you know, would break into four at some point, and this reflects what we were just saying right now. Different branches that quite can't keep in fact things together due to the generalized crisis. This happens also to the Habsburgs, as you know, and this would endanger overall, together with the growth of other polities, but within the same ducal environment, a force that could oppose a more centralizing one. For example, the Burgraves of Nuremberg were also quite powerful. During the 14th century, this would be particularly evident, also because the fortunes of the Wittelsbachs went down after Ludwig. Right here we are in the last sort of spurs of some at least attempt, for example, Mediterranean policy. Well, those would continue under Charles of Bohemia, but still to an extent that is uncomparable, say, to the times of Henry VII, even just the ones of Ludwig the Bavarian, right? Interestingly enough, Eichstätt had as its episcopal vassals, among the others, the Franconian nobles, nobiles, literally in the source, or lords, because here it's not entirely clear how institutionalized the status was, of Hohentrüdingen, who were also advocates of the Abbey of Eidenheim from a couple of centuries at least. And during the 13th, specifically, they had grown into a powerful clan, especially after the marriage between Frederick of Trudingen and one of the three heiresses of the Duke Otto VIII of Merania, Margaret of Andechs. Her father had died in 1248. Merania was an important principality, and we'll talk about it perhaps in the original series at some point soon. And there was, even in that circumstance, some further episcopal power that was claiming the Meranian duke remaining lands in Franconia, which was the Bishop of Bamberg. And Frederick of Trudingen's say brothers-in-law, that was the Count of Orlamünde, as well as the same Burgrave of Nuremberg that we're talking about before, were able to actually, through this marriage ties, and just the connection with the Meranian house in general, to make their claims on those territories in the 60s of the 13th century, which provided them with substantial power and wealth, and also the prestigious status of count, right, which the Hohentrüdingen dynasty adopted literally for themselves, given this new domains that they had acquired. Around the 90s of the 13th century, the grandchildren of Frederick and Margaret divided their territories. You have Frederick that takes the new territories near the diocese of Bamberg, Ulrich keeping the nominal original patrimony of the Hohentrüdingen house, together with, of course, the comital dignity, except for the fact that as count, Ulrich did not really own any district, any Landgericht, right? This was basically the only difference between him and Count Berthold III of Graisbach that we saw before. They were both counts, and they had actually a similar level of power, especially now as we've seen that the Hohentrüdingen house possessions had been split further. So the assets were quite similar, but there was no public district associated with the counts of Hohentrüdingen now. Differently from Graisbach, the Landgericht of which we have observed in its end, right? And in fact, talking about the size of wealth, before we looked at the Count of Graisbach, and we said how powerful was he? He had something like 20 families of knights in his retinue. Well, the Count Ulrich of Hohentrüdingen had pretty much the same, right? So that you have the equal size. The most important knight family was one of the seneschals of Spielberg, which was after the castles of Hohentrüdingen and Allerheim, the most important in the comital domain. There was some move, as we said, by Eichstätt on the same Hohentrüdingen possessions as overlords over the county proper, and specifically of the same Hohentrüdingen castle as a consequence, with all what depended on it, which was in fact the heart of the seigneury. And in spite, or exactly because of this, trying to escape this influence, when the Hohentrüdingen dynasty collapsed, the main beneficiaries of this were the counts of Oettingen and the burgraves of Nuremberg. So the Count Ulrich died in 1310. He had two daughters left under the guardianship of his elder brother, the Count Frederick, who dies in 1332. So his nieces that have married now consequently bring to another division of the lands, respectively, under these were the husbands, the Counts Henry of Schauenburg and Berthold of Marstetten and Graisbach, as we've seen before, because this was the guy who had received all that stuff by Ludwig of Wittelsbach. Hohentrüdingen was given to, in fact, him, Spielberg to the Count Henry, and Berthold essentially passed to Bavaria, the former, in 1342, while the seneschalcy of Spielberg went to Henry of Schauenburg's daughter, Imagina, who married one of the young counts of Oettingen, who in fact received thus as her husband the title as well, for his line, at least, in the male inheritance. In fact, it would be permanently integrated into the Oettingen Principality. Hohentrüdingen itself, given again, it's the collapse of the signory that held it was pledged by Bavaria to the burgraves of Nuremberg. This was initially seen as a sort of temporary compromise, but it was never changed. So essentially, the burgraves of Nuremberg kept the Hohentrüdingen assets for good, interestingly enough, and this depended, of course, on the relations between Bavarian. What these other powers were doing, right? The burgraves of Nuremberg. I should make a video about that, by the way. It's an interesting policy, also sort of an exceptional one, both by institution and a bit also from a territorial standpoint, the size and the frontier area. So when we look at the broader accomplishments of the bishopric of Eichstätt, and so this, as we've seen, pretty, I can't say fully predatory, but sort of, quite enterprisingly, manipulative and trying to say expansionistic diocese, and so what they got in this in 14th century policy, we'll see something else now about it, is so-so, right? They won and lost. There was the reacquisition of Hirschberg and its officium in 1316. We'll see this, how it had happened on another occasion. On the other hand, were other rivals of the Eichstätt diocese that had reinforced themselves exactly because of the feuds with the same bishopric. For example, the Counts of Oettingen that we have just seen gaining from the houses of Hohentrüdingen. This had been the case also for the one of Hirschberg. There was also a confirmation, of course, of the fiefs that Eichstätt had historically acquired. So this, I explained this in the videos about princely Germany, did bring to some sort of better definition of the areas, of the spheres of influence. At a higher, but also the lower spheres, the extensional capacity shrinks by the mid-14th century, and you have these princes that essentially arise in status, like they are more fixed to a specific territory that is more difficult to elude. Of course, yes, in feudal affairs things could go differently. We've seen here literally an episcopal overlord that controls some laymen that also have their own, in fact, dynastic issues, and so in that sense the episcopate can profit of that. This is it's not exclusive of Germany, but it's sort of very typical of Germany in this case, because, as we were saying before, the importance of ecclesiastical power in the history of the country. In 1362, the Bishop Berthold of Eichstätt still thought that there could be a possibility of extending his lordship of both Wallerstein castles that were actually the main residences of the Counts of Oettingen. So quite a presumption, and that evidently was also feasible to some extent to turn into reality, and that was sort of, this looked like a final showdown, right? That was an almost ultimatum for which, of course, they would have gone against one another, and if the Eichstätt bishopric had failed, like so, that the Oettingen territory as a whole would have not been disturbed by the bishop as well. There had been, however, some setbacks, as we partly illustrated in the 20s, in the 30s. The Eichstätt bishops had essentially failed as lords of Graisbach and Hohentrüdingen. The guy who benefited the most, as we've seen, was Louis the Bavarian's vassal slash protege, the Count Berthold of Neuffen-Marstetten. When he died, as we saw before in 1342, those territories went to Bavarian house. It was an important acquisition for, as we'll see now, the reinforcement of the St. Wittelsbachs in the region. There is no doubt, however, that the most powerful lords in the Eichstätt region were the Burgraves of Nuremberg that had expanded quite much and that would keep doing so also in the following century with great great capacity, great sense of politics and administration. For example, the Landgericht of Kadolsburg was transformed into the Margravate of Ansbach. A lot of this came literally from pledges to them, right? There had been other figures, Philip and Markart, for example. Those who had the other bishops of the early 14th century that again had not had as much power as actually their predecessors of the generation before, Reinbolto and Conrad II. There had been a confrontation with the Hirschberg that, as we've seen in the other video, dated from quite a long time before, and still this conflict went on. And one has to understand why the first pair of bishops was also less effective than the latter, right? It's not just capacity, it's a mix of things, right? And remember, these were powerful landlords with military retinues. They were able to impose their will also violently. Testaments had been particularly important in sanctioning certain passages. For example, the Count Gebhard V's will, 1291, 1296, 1304, secured, importantly, the Hirschberg position in front of the claims of the Bishop of Eichstätt. Right? These were just statements. At some point, we don't have time now to explain in depth like what these testaments actually were, because one thing is just having a right, but also letting it die away. Like the fact that these guys could make these testaments, could broker some deals with other actors, and would recognize their power was ipso facto, quite important recognition of their power, right? And to an extent, you couldn't even do much at this point in history. There's much greater written documentation and practice. So, the Eichstätt's claims, in spite of this ecclesiastical immunity's advantage in general, that was devoid of, as we've seen, dynastic problems like of inheritance, whatever. It was mostly about a bishopric that could not be eliminated, right? Had, however, not been enough to break, like they had been sheltered, the Counts of Hirschberg had been sheltered effectively by these attempts through their wills. For example, claims of the lordship over Hohentrüdingen, Graisbach, and Wassertrüdingen castles, together with all the appurtenances that every time, as we've seen, could be even Landgericht power, right? So public one, the districtal one, had been thwarted by the Hirschberg counts, right? They kept the bishops of Eichstätt at bay. Surely these bishops and counts had their own personalities. For example, Gebhard V of Hirschberg was really a violent, unruly, and sort of quite aggressive aristocrat who would not just be counted with a no. But exactly for that, he was combative, tenacious, and determined enough regarding his rights over the Principality of Eichstätt, and as such, he did not back down when the Dukes of Bavaria stepped in the way. And this brought actually to his reward by Duke Rudolf I, who made him rise, and this brought in fact to the defeat of Duke Rudolf I, making Gebhard rising greatly in importance in the Holy Roman Empire during the reign of Albert I. So this was one case. When you look at, for example, instead at Count Conrad of Oettingen, for example, you realize that he just did not have the power. He was sort of a knight errant of some sort, and even though he together with his family supported the diocese of Eichstätt, he still wouldn't get as much like from the same diocese in terms of recognition of his fiefs and property, like to an extent like in fact Gebhard of Hirschberg had done, right? The great figure in Bavaria, as we understood, was Louis IV of Wittelsbach. He was he had an amazing character. He was a great administrator. Also in Italy, he essentially got what he had to get. I mean, he did not overstay. He did not launch himself into some sort of broader plans of conquest. First of all, he did not have the resources. It was a completely different time already from 10 years before, the time of Henry VII. And in Bavaria, he showed this great determination, but also like care, tact, consideration, as we observed before. And he had a quite clear vision of what properly leadership management was. Like, this is the guy who made Munich rise to the importance of a city it is today. He's the guy who built princely Bavaria, if you want. And you see, because Bavaria had ups and downs, made a video about it. This was the heyday in medieval times under Ludwig, and yet what he impressed on a land that after all would not escalate to a major power in general in German history is still, right, one that reached the thresholds of that because of this rule. When, for example, Ludwig regained Herrieden for Eichstätt, as we saw in 1316, he still saw it fit to support the County of Graisbach from the moment, especially of his royal election, because, as we observe, he thought that after all there was some public culture. This is very interesting in princely German times, because these guys had emerged even just as individual houses, because the public system had collapsed. So even in the smaller affairs, provincial, local affairs even, were concerned, yes, this was molding attentively and successfully, as we were explaining before, some higher elite level, some, polity that would not, with its balance, threaten your own, whatever. It was a consideration that an imperial fief was essentially something you had to protect as King of Germany. They're not simply passing to the church just because they had made this game for which the bishop would inherit that, and so they would try to mix the ecclesiastical with the lay level in terms of territorial acquisition. This was surely very much done in Germany because of the reasons of privatization and sort of lack of authority in parts of Germany, royally speaking. But this guy says no, right? He had the power for doing that, of course, and but he had also a reason, a vision, and an intelligence to do that, right? Ludwig was like he was a handsome, he had a very energetic character in some way. He had like this vision of a positive rule, a very big pool of personal energy and pragmatic capacities that brought him even to be Holy Roman Emperor. So this is definitely, there are some other things that did not go exactly how, of course, many things that did not go exactly as he wanted. But at this local level, you realize what he could manage and what he did concretely, and he did well. He did good in this case. So, aside from the Count Berthold of Neufen's right as a heir to the Graisbachs, and so actually the broader connection that had existed with that house and why Ludwig chose him, there have must be some broader consideration of how to practically administer the aforementioned Graisbach's Landgericht. Right? It's a matter of justice. It's a matter of, again, probably a concrete administration and its efficiency. Right? There had been some problems already, for example, with the Hirschberg Landgericht, as since the beginning of the century, because the bishops owned the territory while the House of Bavaria owned the jurisdiction of Hirschberg. And this was really also a novelty, because you see here there was an attempt of cooperation, of sorting out these compromises and trying to institutionalize them, right? And well, Ludwig pondered on that and said, you know what, let's not do this in the Graisbach Landgericht, because it's just going to be messy. It's not going to help when it comes to render justice, to administrate the local communities, right? How do you govern them, right? If there is this inherent ambiguity and sort of overly complicated passage and needed cooperation with an institution that technically is not even your own, when the church really is concerned in an absolute sense. And this was especially true in a time like Ludwig's reign, when the Bishop Henry of Reichenegg, for example, was supporting John the 22nd, was supporting the Avignonese papacy. Right, the guy was bishop of Graisbach between 1329 and 1344. Right, and so what actually the lay regime in Graisbach did was backing the Wittelsbachs as well. And this sort of parried not just the blow that could arrive from there, but literally outflanked the same Eichstätt's diocese in Bavaria. And this is incredibly important. Like what we have seen regarding the investiture controversy had not really ended. I mean, actually, Ludwig's reign was the peak of that sort of mutual disconfession of the papacy and the empire at a level of general collapse of the two universal authorities in that context. National monarchies are rising, so the papacy is actually very powerful, but it's also not capable of controlling to the same extent political, moral reach Europe as, say, in the 13th century. Ludwig of Bavaria is, he gets to Rome, gets the Holy Roman Imperial crown, but basically doesn't do anything else. In Italy, as a consequence, he's still sort of across the Alps, interferes to some degree. There are Ghibelline bikers, there is a general awareness of the prerogatives that the ruler has in that specific field. But there is, in fact, this hostility still at home, connected with exactly the idea that if a church like the one of Eichstätt wants to support, to back the papacy that has excommunicated the same emperor in that case, well, they will do that, and they will, of course, do it in this specific case because they had already some problems in maintaining what they wanted, right? They, as again, regarding the Graisbach Landgericht, they wouldn't say anything, but politically, right, they would say, but we don't recognize you. And this is Bavaria, right? So this is technically the place from which, of course, the Wittelsbachs are building their fortune historically, and at this point they're sort of emerging, but there are these seigneuries that's what we call it princely Germany, also as far as ecclesiastical principalities are concerned, because you do meet with this opposition, you do meet with this level of territorial fragmentation and problems in maintaining the same, also to a balance, because there is no way to compact it more than much at the end of the day, if not on the long term, and through mostly dynastic ties. So sometimes, like, you need to descend into the minutiae, into the apparent ones. I mean, for the people who lived at the time, this was very important stuff, and not just locally, because as we've seen, Upper Bavaria was quite a strategic area, right? The Wittelsbachs had a kind of all over the place political stance, especially after Ludwig, also because the house sort of broke down into various branches. But generally speaking, the compaction of for example, the Eichstätt lordship, or under its bishops, or as we've seen, the rise of the burgraviate of Nuremberg. Well, those were all things that were there to stay in many ways. They influenced with the Burggraf at some point was a Hohenzollern, for example. And the guy also served in Italy under Ludwig. So, again, incredibly complicated policies. Again, when you get down to, like, you think France is complex, right? You're just coming from the Bourbon video the other day. Dynastically, yes, it's pretty messed up. But when it gets to Germany or Italy, well, that's where things start really getting interesting, and it's very difficult at times to even just tell the story, because you hear this. In order to tell one, there is another one that is connected with it. You can't digress on, right? But it's the overall sense that you have to make of this, that the sum, the take, the sort of the historian's judgment would, I think many people still don't get about history, that it is about personal opinion. Just, we should be able to discriminate between personal opinions that are actually valuable and informed and supported, and the ones that are not, right? But you can't have this mess, like, presented to anyone and say, well, give me your take about that. It's an incredible mess. Like, this is not even just to say it takes, I don't know, intelligence. Everybody can be intelligent and not getting this, because it mostly takes some habituation to it, because it's not easy to understand, admittedly, right? It's not much the fact that it's complicated, it's the fact that it forces you to get into these details, and it's not something you would do every day for no reason. That's mostly why it gets down to this. But I think when we talk about the dialectic between count and bishop in Germany, these examples, especially about the 14th century, that we didn't really explore that much. I mean, I think princely Germany is one of the great underrated times in history. It's a mess, right, as you've just seen and we have discussed. But exactly for that, after all, when you realize that some sort of order emerged, in spite of all, it's sorry, I got distracted me. It's one of the things that you must go in depth only if you know the history of the local countries. That's why I make all these regional history things, all the Italian communes, because people, I don't think they really get what, this is not just about the Holy Roman Empire, but comparatively, what like Europe was really like at the time, and say why it is the way it is today because of that. This is something I realize. I don't say it to discourage or whatever, but after having gotten 1.5 million views, and looking at the comments and whatever, let's be honest, guys. Most of the people at least that get on this channel and keep staying, they don't care about that. They don't get it, right? Aside from whether I can be explicative enough or whatever, it's just, it doesn't click. It doesn't ring to them that there is that veil, right, through which they have to get in order to understand even just a video like this that I think is very simple per se, because it's narrow. Yes, it does talk about broader stuff, but it's still this perspective, for example, the bigger international picture and the local one. I get often the impression people watch my content just because it talks about a country, and not because they care. And even the people say, "Oh, I come from here," but do you actually get what I said? It was no, not well. Okay, that's unfortunate because I'm not aware of any content, at least on YouTube, that provides you with this. And it's, of course, maybe it's not the site, it's not the format, like it can't provide you with that, agreed, but it's also like the only source from here that you can hear about these topics, because literally, I don't know, there may be some hidden channel that YouTube does not promote, like mine, that maybe talks about it, but it's nowhere to be seen. I'm on YouTube, at least watching YouTube from, a long time, and almost 2 decades. Well, not maybe something less, but I've never seen it. So one should ask oneself why, for example, why do I do this? That's also an interesting question. I don't make channel updates anymore. I used to discuss this stuff. But at some point I realized that history is more important, that if you form this intricate web of information and you're able to catch even a single person's attention in it, you will have obtained something good, something positive. And I believe that this is what pushes me, honestly. Like it's also a matter of yes, there is some reward, but it's not as much as I pour into it, at least in terms of feedback, right? And what I learned in order to make these videos is amazing. I would keep doing them, even just to to no one, in front of no one, just to learn so much. But given that there is the opportunity, I think it's important to reflect also on what this is, because that I don't brag all the time about my accomplishments or how it is, but let's say in a way or in another, you're sure, for better or for worse, of one thing: you won't find anything like this anywhere on YouTube, right? That's as much the actual information you can find on books, on studies, on articles, and you have to get them or whatever. But having someone who choose them, it sort of takes a look at them and with a rigorous background and makes an analysis and a critique of that, it's a completely different thing. And it sort of enriches the debate. When people say we should debate, we should talk history, they'll, like, most of the conversation are being had on the even just on this medium are completely distant, but from the point, from the subjects, from the historical depth, from the probably the necessity of history for developing as a mature human being. That's the thing that perplexes me the most, honestly. It's not the few views or this is just a reflection of the thing, that there is apparently out there not an effort to get that. an effort to understand or to being accepted, even to accept criticism, to accept evaluation. That's something we have completely removed, where it's become a sort of complete hypocrisy about, like, today we'll say what I think. We should stop flattering ourselves. And I say it because every time I sit here, I actually pose myself that problem, like, what I'm going to say, does it make sense? Is it understandable? Is it useful? Does it have any value? And making an effort, like at least I tried. I don't know if you see it, but when it's out there, like, and you realize that there's none of this, you say, but it's reassuring to an extent, because you feel like you're moving forward. Like, basically, you don't see anyone doing, at least on this platform. I fortunately know in real life, well, this is also real life, but I mean, in person, people who do advance, but they, my colleagues, etc., but those are not going to be heard so much because they don't do what I do, for example. And admittedly, I could do more, right? But I also just publishing whatever. But I also realized that if I didn't do this, I wouldn't know. I wouldn't have that, for example, that pool of just general consideration for history the way I developed in here, for even just writing an article or knowing how to frame a certain historical theme. That's something that I experienced, for example, immediately when you pass from the master to the doctoral thesis. The first thing you notice is that you think that with your master thesis is just, oh my god, it's about this topic, I know so much. The doctorate widens the thing by scale, and so you realize that that thing you had focused on is just one thing, and there is a structural element, and until you expand your horizons, you can't get. And so you will think that the history or existence stops just to that. Right? This is true for many other infinite levels of knowledge, but again, you look back and you just don't see much behind you. That can be perplexing. And again, I make these digressions. I admit also to lengthen a bit the time of the video, but it's not really just about that. I should make more historian videos, but you see, these are considerations that stem always from a historical background. There are those videos. I know lots of people are out there after my like trying to sort out my ideology. Why don't you listen to the actual history content? Because everything I say has developed from historical knowledge. It's not an ideology that comes before the historical notion. I didn't have that. I built it through history because basically I also don't learn much else in the first place. Or at least, well, I do something, but it's still revolving around my way to interpret history. And that's a symptom, in my opinion. I mean, that kind of questioning is a symptom of the loss, of the lack of point of reference, the incapacity of getting the thing that history is real, that this is like the actual political, military, and social stuff that happened, so that you don't have to escape in a world on your own, make up fantasy, or pretending to evaluate things you've never studied. Just listen to that. Listen to history. Right? Habituate yourself to the actual process of rigorous learning, studying, right? Specifically, and that everything will change. I can assure you. In any case, for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.